All right, well, thanks everyone. Welcome back. One more push, then a break, and then a dinner, and then we're off. So we're coming around the home stretch. This last session is titled Transnational Threats and the Future of Liberal Democracy. The transnational threats part, we were just chatting. I don't remember exactly how central that was to the planning and conversation. So it's really going to be about sort of the deeper cultural, religious underpinnings and the future of liberal democracy. Some of the themes we were just touching on the last session that lead in very nicely to this last conversation. What we were hoping essentially to talk about what challenges without, like non-state actors, may expand in the coming years, even beyond Ukraine and Gaza. And how might a new wave of leaders on the continent address the far-right movements that we were just talking about this morning, AfD in Germany, Reform in the UK, National Rally in France, Hungary, Spain, Italy, and so on. How does Trump's re-election implicate the future of Ukraine? Sevgil and her team of 200 people in Kyiv are working on how can journalists bring sunlight and accountability to these issues? But again, getting to the underpinnings part, the cultural religious part. How is religion being used in these movements, either as a source of longing and wistfulness for an earlier era, as a buttress against state secularism, or sometimes more positively, as an extra-political, longer-lasting underpinning for pluralism, equitable public pluralism. All right, so here's our two speakers. Natalie Tocci has... Tocci, forgive me. Natalie Tocci has 4 jobs, and that's why she's only joining us for part of the day today before the next thing. She's the director of Istituto Affari Internazionali.
That was very good.
All right, one and one. She's a professor at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. She's an honorary professor at Tübingen, and she's the independent director of ASIA. You can take a look at more of that in her program. There's a lot there. She and Bruno really have a number of irons in the fire, but she's been a special advisor to 2 EU high representatives. She wrote the European Global Strategy Playbook and worked on its implementation. She was the Pierre Keller visiting professor at HKS. And prior to that, she has served on the boards of Edison and later NE. So a lot going on. Bruno Macias, who's been leaning in, forgive me.
I'm going to do it like you.
Yeah, come on.
No,
Macias.
that was good.
No rehearsal. Should have done this. Bruno
Macias.
Bruno Macias is the foreign correspondent at the New Statesman. He was the Portuguese Europe minister from 13 to 15. He's a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's a member of the Advisory Council for the Brussels Institute of Geopolitics, former senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, Hudson, the Renmin University in China, in Beijing. He's written 4 books so far: Dawn of Eurasia, Belt and Road, New America Has Begun, and Geopolitics for the End Time. But the one that really matters, World Builders, will be out in February. So we're going to start with Natalie, and then go to Bruno, and then over to you. So Natalie.
Fantastic, Josh. Thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. This is my first time. I barged into that last session, and I thought it was a great hour that I listened to, so I'm really looking forward to this. So what I wanted to do is sort of start off by talking about what I would define as the second wave of nationalist populism in Europe. And the way in which this, well, firstly, why it has come about, how it has changed compared to that first wave, and how it connects to some of the big international questions ongoing, both obviously what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic, and this connects to some of the points that were made at the end of the last session, but also as it connects to Ukraine, Middle East, and then I'm sure that Bruno is going to pick up from there. So first remark that I would make is we are in a second wave. I mean, that is fairly obvious. And whereas I would define the first wave as really sort of beginning around 2012, 2013, and then peaking at about 2015, 2016, and then going down. And it continued going down throughout the COVID pandemic. And, you know, sort of the last year of it was really the the beginning of Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine. And then it really, as of 2023, starts picking up in what I would define as a second wave. And obviously, we've been seeing it in elections over the last couple of years across Europe, and obviously sort of it all came together with the European election in June, but of course also several national elections, both prior to the European election and following it. So first sort of set of remarks is really what characterizes the difference between these two waves. And the first thing that I would say is that it is fairly clear that in the second wave, far right, mainly far right. So whereas in that first wave there was both a far left story and a far right story, I think now it's, with some exceptions in France and Germany, but it's generally speaking far more of a far right story in the second wave. And that as opposed to the first wave, there is a far greater level of sophistication of these parties, movements, increasingly governments and leaders. So, if one is to take, one indicator of this greater sophistication, I think looking, for instance, again, looking at it from a very European vantage point, the approach to the European Union. Once upon a time, in that first wave, there was a very blunt exit agenda. So if you're a nationalist populist, you want to leave the European Union. Now, obviously, also as a consequence of the fact that Brexit did happen, and it wasn't exactly an incredible success, you basically hardly have any of these far-right governments, parties, movements that actually have an exit agenda. Now, I think mistakenly, this has been taken as a good sign. As a sign of moderation. See, they're learning, and especially as they come to power, they are moderating. I actually think that is a very big mistake. I don't think it's a sign of moderation at all. I actually think that it's the indicator of a far more radical agenda. You don't simply want to exit something that you don't like, which, sad as it is, the UK left and we were all very sad, but ultimately it didn't represent an existential danger to the European integration project. If you want to stay and erode and corrode the project from within, then you really do pose an existential danger to it. And so I think essentially what has been happening is a learning process in these movements, parties, leaders, governments. And there has been an understanding that you basically, this is not a one-shot game. It's an incremental game, and it's essentially a sort of boiling frog scenario. And this is broadly what I would define as a sort of urbanization of these movements. Viktor Orban, firstly, he was, and he has been an incremental sort of far-right leader. When he was first elected back in 2010, he didn't appear to be particularly radical. And this has been kind of growing over time. Hungary has never had, under his rule, the aim of leaving the European Union. No, why on earth would you want to do that? You want to extract as much benefit from this animal and then gradually kill it from within. And I think, as I said, there has been a learning process, and broadly speaking, I would say that the vast majority of these parties now follow a similar kind of script. I think a second element of that learning is the fact that these parties have become far more coordinated with one another. I think there used to be, again, quite a bit of complacency amongst others that basically, and me included, you always used to say, these nationalists, they're not very good at international cooperation by definition. And they may all agree that whatever, migration is awful and the European Union is too, but ultimately they will not share an agenda. And I think to an extent that explanation obviously does have some truth to it. But I think it has actually proved to be a fairly lazy explanation, because if you actually see the way in which there has been growing coordination, again, if you take as an example the European Parliament, these are now groups which are organized fairly coherently in kind of three groups. Whereas in the previous legislature, several of these parties didn't belong to any of these groups, which actually reduced their, sort of policy-making, shaping influence. Now they are organized in these three groups. So I think there's an element of coordination there, which also indicates a far greater level of sophistication compared to what we had before. I think, thirdly, the evolution of this has actually been the way in which they have succeeded in building bridges towards the center-right. Now, if again, we take the European Parliament, and I keep on going back to this, not because I think it's most relevant, but simply because I think it indicates some of the trends which are actually ongoing in different European countries. There has been, the center-right has been increasingly sort of inclined to cooperate with some of these, the slightly more palatable, in a sense, perhaps, far-right groupings. And of course, they have done so with the aim of moderating them. But again, this is where I think part of the hubris kind of kicks in. And actually, every time that they have done so, the effect has been a cannibalization process the other way around. And I think we see this playing out at national level, and I think we will probably increasingly see it play out at international level. If we take the example of Italy and of the Netherlands, again, these are two cases in which there has been a readiness of the center-right to cooperate with the far-right, aiming to somehow domesticate the far-right. And every time this has happened, actually, the party that has then become the majority shareholder of a right-wing government has been the far-right. And I think now in the European Parliament, yes, of course, we can sit back and relax and say, well, there is a traditional majority which has re-elected Ursula von der Leyen. And in fact, in that traditional majority, we don't not only have the center-right, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, but we also have the Greens. This is actually good news. But you look at the way in which already on specific policy issues, actually the majority that has brought forward certain resolutions is a majority between the center-right and the far-right. The first instance in which this happened is actually on something which is not particularly all that bad, which has to do with Venezuela, actually. But the non-recognition of Maduro's non-re-election was actually the product of a majority between the center-right and the far-right. And I think it indicates the fact that, we can see this playing out over and over again, particularly on issues related to climate and obviously to migration. That's the obvious case. And it has to do with this gradual normalization of the far-right, which has been largely due and caused by the behavior and I think the hubristic behavior of the center-right. So moving on to the explanations. Again, going back to that first wave, I think, sort of when, for instance, Donald Trump was first elected, and when there was that first wave of nationalist populism in the EU, which, as I said, really came sort of, and it was fed by the Eurozone crisis and the so-called migration crisis. I keep on referring to it as the so-called because it was more of a political crisis than an actual migration crisis. But anyway, that would take us in a different direction. But I think the explanations that we were all trying to get our heads around in that first phase were very much related to material conditions. And of course, this was happening, as I said, after the global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, austerity policies, the way in which the global financial crisis exposed inequalities, the way in which those inequalities were then exacerbated by austerity policies. And then, of course, migration, but understood as I'm not quite sure how to define it, as an objective phenomenon, right? Rather than the politicization of migration. And so we were kind of single-handedly focused on how to get those material conditions right once again. And if you think, for instance, about the, if you think of the election of Joe Biden back in 2020, I mean, the whole narrative was, how do we get those conditions right again? How do we pursue a foreign policy for the middle class? How do we get jobs back, industrial policy? And I'm not trying to argue that those are not part of the explanation. But given that some things have happened, I mean, we are no longer in the sort of, hyper-liberal world of the 1990s. So, there has been an element of kind of reckoning with those mistakes. But very clearly, as that second wave picked up, these material explanations have sort of, I think, emerging as being insufficient as explanations. And I think this is where we really start struggling in trying to figure out exactly what is happening. Because we kind of know what falls into that material box, but we struggle to connect the dots between what falls into a more ideational, ideological, identity, culture-related box. And as I said, we can kind of point to some elements, and many of these emerged in the previous discussion, so I'm not going to sort of rehash them, but there's very clearly something that has to do with the loss of a sense of identity. There is something that has to do with culture. There has a lot that has to do with religion and the way in which that is brought back in to provide a sense of kind of grounding. There is now, especially after the US election, a lot, sort of the whole educational divide, which I think also, I mean, it's partly related, obviously, to those material conditions, but I don't think the explanation is exhausted but by those material conditions. So we can kind of point to different elements there, but I don't think we really, and I have certainly, this is what I'd really like to have this conversation about, I haven't got my own head around how these dots connect and how both the material and the ideational sort of factors are then amplified by the information, disinformation, social media sort of part of this story. Sort of the way in which, for instance, I mean, it goes back to some of the discussions that we were having in the previous session. There is, something to be said about the way in which, sort of middle-class urban boys are being targeted with messages, identity-related messages that bring them then to the far right, that go a little bit along the lines of, they all want to turn you into gays and sort of lesbians. I mean, there's that element to it, which is not exactly the same message that the sort of rural, lower middle class men in the suburbs, for instance, are being targeted with, which have and that has a lot to do with migration, for example. So there's something there, and I think there's so there's the material, there's the ideational, and then there are the amplifiers in a sense. But again, understanding what the connections between all of this is, I think. It's certainly not clear in my own mind. Last sort of set of things that I wanted to touch on, because then this sort of creates a segue onto Bruno, has to do with the way in which the big international questions are connected to all of this. So very clearly, there's the obvious transatlantic connection. I mean, it is very clear in my mind that now the re-election of Donald Trump is going to galvanize these movements even further. They feel that they really are on a roll, and they probably are on a roll. And there is in a sense, sort of legitimization that comes from, if this is happening in the heart of liberal democracy, then surely we can't make the argument in Europe that the rise of these movements is undemocratic, right? So there's, sort of that galvanization that happens. There's obviously the vindication of the Orbans of this world that are, this is the moment in which they basically say, well, I told you so, it was going to happen. There is probably going to be, maybe I'm kind of, I have my own Italian bias here, but I think there's going to be quite a lot of lowering of the masks, including in my own country. Where, up until when you had a Joe Biden sitting in the White House, there's been a certain composure, sort of good behavior, especially on issues like Ukraine. I would be extremely surprised if that continues. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of lowering of masks and repositioning as a consequence of all this. So I think the other element, which may be, I'm sort of a little bit in a sort of somewhat scattered way, but I think another element which also connects to the religion aspect of it, which may be worth talking about, and again, maybe there's also, an Italian bias here, is also the role of the Pope in all of this. I think the way in which, again, I'm thinking mainly about Ukraine, but the way in which the Pope's positioning on Ukraine has actually created a legitimization of essentially pro-Russian views in a sort of moral legitimization of pro-Russian views, certainly in my own country, I think is something probably worth discussing. And then finally, and this is the very last thing that I'll say, because I know that this is really going to be the focus of what Bruno's going to be saying, the connection to what has been happening in Gaza and the Middle East. And the way in which this has brought back up, actually, a divide in Europe that has obviously always been there, but it was then latent for a number of years. And now it's kind of surfaced back up. Just think about events in, for instance, the Netherlands over the last few days. But also the way in which these two sets of, these two wars are then connected to the total erosion, crumbling, fracture, almost beyond repair, of Europe's reputation in the broader world, and in particular in the global south. It is really, it's tragic, really. I mean, the way in which when Russia's large-scale invasion began, Europe was with the global majority. It may have been, Ukraine was with the global majority. I mean, it may have been that countries in the global south were not really prepared to pay a price, in a sense, to ensure that violations of international law were somehow rectified. But they were with, they were very clear in terms of where they stood. Now, if we were to, in fact, I remember sort of having a conversation with a diplomat in the UN, and there was a moment, it was about 9-10 months ago, when there was this idea that there would be a new, to put forward a new resolution on Ukraine in the UN General Assembly, actually connected to the recognition of the Holodomor. And the advice that the Ukrainians received was, this is not a good idea, because very clearly you will get we will get far fewer votes in favor than what we did back in 2022. And the truth is that this has nothing to do with Ukraine itself, and it obviously has to do with Gaza. And so I think that sort of battered reputation is something which is then connected. I mean, this kind of very fragile international position, which then interlocks with a fragility within our own liberal democracies, is, I think, something which is intimately related. But at times it almost feels, and I'm sorry to end on a very pessimistic note, that there is really very little that we can do at this point to rectify it. I mean, we've just kind of blown it so much that it's difficult to really think of things. I mean, I don't mean to say here that therefore they shouldn't be done. Of course they should. But it's very difficult to imagine actually what can be done to rectify the situation. Anyway, I'll stop there on that happy note.
It's a great prompt. It's been great. Brilliant.
All right, so I like this idea of different waves. I'm kind of inclined to think that each wave reveals a new aspect of what this movement in Europe means. And I'll try to give you my own take on what it means. My approach is, as always, for those who know me, very geopolitical, in the sense that I always start from geopolitical variables to try to understand even domestic politics. And I would suggest that what explains this new kind of European politics, and it really is a new kind of European politics. Sometimes I have to kind of pinch myself, think back to the time when I was going to the councils in Brussels. Everything that people said in those councils back then would now be laughed at. And everything that people say today in those councils would consider beyond the pale 10 years ago on things like China, like trade, like immigration. I remember going to Budapest and lecturing my Hungarian counterpart how building a wall or a fence was unacceptable in Europe. And now, if I went somewhere and said this, maybe I'd be out of a job within a week because it is very much acceptable. So things have changed, and why have they changed? As I look at developments over this past decade, I see, and this was talked about in the last panel, I see an enormous loss of confidence in the West, loss of control. And I've come to believe that it's this loss of control that then feeds directly into these new movements that promise to give us back control over global politics, but eventually also over national politics, over our lives. There is an acute sense of loss of control, an acute sense that the West is no longer dominant. Let me give you a very striking example. North Korean troops in Ukraine. One may agree or disagree that this is significant from a material point of view. From a symbolic point of view, it's extremely significant. I would even ask you, when was the last time that an army from Asia has been in Europe under its own operational and political control? So not Indian troops in World War I and World War II under operational and political control of Great Britain, but under its own political control. Because even though North Korean troops may be under Russian operational control, they're under North Korean political control. There's a lot of speculation about what North Korea is getting in return, possibly something very valuable having to do with missile technology. That's what the former South Korean Minister of Foreign Affairs told me a couple of days ago in Switzerland, Minister Khan. So it is new because European armies have been roaming all over Asia for a few centuries. But when was the last time that an Asian army was present in Europe? I would suggest maybe in the 13th century, unless you consider the Ottoman armies Asian or unless you consider the Russian armies Asian. It really is something that Europeans are not used to. Now, even if you think that North Korea is not that relevant, there's also Iran, which is actively involved in the war in Ukraine. The war itself, this deadlock, this war that threatens to become permanent, is something that we're used to seeing in other parts of the world. But I don't think many people believed in 2022 that 2-3 years later we still would be with no resolution in sight. This loss of power from a formal hegemonic West looks to many people like a colonization in reverse. You hear this over and over again on the far right. We are being invaded, North Korean troops, but immigration. We are being forced to adapt our lifestyles to the others. And many of the messages sound exactly like the messages that were coming from societies outside the West in the first stages of colonization. It is a sense that we are being attacked, we are under threat. And this we is what needs to be unpacked. Because I would suggest that the we, Natalie talked a bit about this, I would suggest the we is not the nation state. It's something like the West. I saw a very nice Twitter meme the other day with all the populist leaders, including Trump, including for whatever reason, posted by Matteo Salvini, including for some reason Vivek Ramaswamy, including our own Portuguese Ventura. So I felt very proud that now there were eight men there, and Marine Le Pen, and we're defending the West against the barbarians. And now Portugal is so much a part of the West that it's even including there. So there's a civilizational rather than a national logic. It seems very obvious to me. I'll leave it here, but maybe we'll discuss it later. But it's we, the West, that are being attacked. So it doesn't surprise me that these movements are working so well together. Because as the Matteo Salvini meme said, it was the West is back. It was something like that he posted. Christianity plays a certain role here, let me point out. I think I will mention a lot of things, and I'll mention them quickly and leave them for the discussion. Christianity plays a role here because, put yourselves in the place of us Westerners. what can we do to regain our own identity? Where is that identity? We spent centuries trying to create a universal liberal program that wouldn't be particularly European or Western. It would apply to everyone. It was so neutral, so abstract that it would apply to everyone. Now we're forced to defend our identity. Where do we find it? Not in liberalism. Presumably, as some people suggest, farther back in what preceded liberalism, in something like a Christian civilization. That's certainly what Orban does, to find the identity of the West, this West that is under attack, in its past, in some cases a distant past, because it's been a while since Christianity has been our political ordering principle. Christianity exists in Europe, but it hasn't been the political ordering principle for a century or two. Liberalism has been. But as we abandon liberalism, we can't find anything in the future. We return to this past that can help us defend ourselves against the outside world. I would suggest that this kind of organized defense against the rest of the world that we see in the West is very reminiscent of the reactions you saw outside the West to the West's rise. So in fact, if we want to find an analog to what is happening in Europe now, you'll find it, for example, in 18th century Ottoman Empire. How do we organize ourselves against the West? You find it throughout the 19th century, the 20th century, in places like Egypt, in places like Pakistan. In all these places, there was a certain conviction that only a strong state could help you defend yourself against the Western onslaught. There is a certain logic to the idea that an open society is not going to be able to do this. I wonder if an open society is only possible in those parts of the world that are dominant on a global scale. And those parts of the world that feel under attack, they will turn to something like a strong state and even perhaps a strong man. And we see those dynamics happening in Europe. Perhaps we can look back to the past and to what happened in other places and find a rather good analog of what is happening in Europe. Elites are no longer trusted because they are seen as too international, not reliable. They are too global. They are globalists. This is exactly the analog of what happened in places like Persia, the Ottoman Empire, Egypt later on, then in Africa and Latin America, that the elites are looked at with some suspicion because they were westernized. And now we have an interesting phenomenon where elites in the West are seen as too global, not capable of defending our interests in our nation states, too compromised, perhaps even too weak. You know, Trump suggests they're both corrupt, but they're also being taken advantage of all the time by the outsiders. And so we have to turn away from those elites. But we've seen this before in other parts of the world. What is the response that is offered? That we have to be tougher. That we have to abandon our liberal pieties. Do we have to be tough with the rest of the world in the same way that they are tough with us? There is actually a certain orientalizing here. We have to be like the others. We have to be we can't be liberal anymore. We can't be that democratic anymore. We can't be that ideological. We have to do what is necessary, by any means necessary. In a way, we have to imitate them. Very typical of Trump. He's always praising, he'll praise Singapore. Why does he praise Singapore? Not because it is innovative or creative, but because they have the death penalty. They're not soft like we are, and we have to learn. We are now ourselves being orientalized in the image that we created of what Asia is like. Abandoning concepts of legitimacy. Increasingly abandoning concepts of legitimacy. It's not important if our power is regarded as legitimate. What's important is that we're powerful and that we're tough. Where you see this most obviously is, of course, in the case of Gaza. I've been quite shocked by what has happened in Gaza over the past year, but I've been equally shocked, or perhaps even more shocked, by the reaction in the West, by the way we have reacted to events in Gaza. There has, in fact, been no hypocrisy. There has been no attempt to pretend that we're trying to do something better, but we're failing because the world is complicated. Gradually, the message you're getting, particularly from Washington, is that we're doing what is necessary, by any means necessary, and we have to be tough. And these are tough people that we're dealing with, and we have to be tough. It's quite remarkable that, in fact, those people that were most opposed to Trump sound like Trump. I'm now convinced that the difference between, even the difference between a Trump and a Biden is much more contextual than we thought. Under the right circumstances, where you can afford to be soft, you can get someone like Biden. Under the wrong circumstances, where October 7th happens, then you get Trump, whether it's Trump in the guise of Biden or whether it's Trump in the guise of Trump. What is the fundamental ontological difference between Marine Le Pen and Ursula von der Leyen? I'm not sure there is. I'm sure there may be a little bit, but 80% is contextual. Under the right circumstances, von der Leyen is going to behave and say the things that Marine Le Pen says. Von der Leyen has certainly not expressed any kind of concern about Gaza. You might even say that she was not interested in the topic. You could say it's not her competence because the Commission president is not supposed to be under the treaty in charge of foreign policy. But every time something happens that affects directly Israeli interests, she rediscovers her foreign policy role very quickly. So there's clearly something else going on, and it's I see it as a transition from Merkel to Le Pen that, in a way, is much more contextual than we used to think. Natalie asked about how much domestic problems are relevant, particularly economic developments. I think it was very tempting for us for a long while to think that the root causes of the nationalist, populist, far-right explosion in Europe were both domestic and economic. I think that's the illusion of control, of resuming control. If we convince ourselves that the factors are economic, we can address them very easily, and it's up to us. If we think it's about social media, then even better, because you just have a European regulation on social media and the problem is solved. But if I am correct, and these factors have to do with the redistribution of power at the global scale, then we are in for quite a ride, because this redistribution will continue, will deepen, and the phenomenon will also deepen. Again, I've seen this story happen in other parts of the world. I've seen it. I've studied it, let's say, with some presumption. There's even, to be a bit provocative here, there's even a phenomenon that I would call a Western Wahhabism. The reaction in the Arab world in the 18th century, go back to first principles and be pure about those first principles. That's the way to react to the West. And you also now see a lot of people in the West saying we have to go back to our first principles. No one quite knows what those first principles are, but that's also the story of Wahhabism, because what are the first principles of Islam? And you see this phenomena being repeated and deepening all the time. And becoming quite dangerous because they are associated with the sense that legitimate power is for suckers, and power has to be based on brute force. This is Trump, but it's not just Trump. That is the thing that I think we learned in the last 8 years. Now that Trump returns, he's going to find an environment that is much more similar to his own thoughts. It's quite dramatic. Quite a dramatic change. Last summer, I made a point of watching the debates here in France. They were really quite fascinating, particularly the two debates between Jordan Bardella and Gabriel Attal. You got here the French equivalent of the American presidential debate, except the two candidates are in their 30s. They are extremely articulate, and they are extremely intelligent, both of them. But apart from that, it's just like an American debate. Now, what was incredible to me was that Bardella was particularly interested in what he had to say, Attal a bit more predictable. Bardella, what he had to say was all about global politics. You might think this is someone that will be talking about the problems of the regions in France or matters of domestic policy. He had 3 points that he kept insisting on. And those points were, first, economic policymaker, what he called economic patriotism. China and other actors are using all the power of the state to increase and improve economic outcomes for their people, and we in the West have to use the same weapons. Otherwise, we're going into a very tough competition unarmed. So we have to use the power of the state to promote good economic outcomes for us, and the term he came up with was economic patriotism. The second point he talked about was climate and the green transition. He presented the green transition as a kind of scam imposed on us Westerners by the rest of the world. We have been intellectually conquered by the rest of the world because we have come to believe in this nonsense about a green transition. We are unilaterally disarming our own economies through the green transition. And again, we have to be much tougher, and we have to learn from them about not caring about the planet if we don't want to be the losers. And then, of course, immigration, which was the central one. And what is the issue with immigration? This has now also become a very hot topic in Portugal. And it's interesting because in Portugal, I can actually witness from the very beginning and already very attentive to what is going to happen, because it started 2 years ago, the intense debate about immigration, particularly Muslim immigration, which is very recent. But in the debate about the Latal, immigration was presented as a problem, again, because it is loss of control. There's been immigration in France for a long time, but this is a new kind of immigration. The immigrants no longer respect us. They no longer, usually this is said, no longer respect our way of life, but what it really means is they no longer respect us. They are too confident in their own cultures. They are not planning to integrate. This obviously has a number of reasons. People now remain in contact with their countries of origin. They no longer have an acute sense of cultural inferiority as they had in the past. They come to France or to Portugal or to the US with the idea of making money, but not assimilating culturally. But this is, again, a reflection of a redistribution of power on the global scale and a loss of cultural power from the West. You no longer have the power to attract these people to your own culture. You either force them, which never works on matters of culture, or then you have to accept the reality that they will preserve their own cultures. Cultural assimilation has become very difficult. Many of these immigrants come to Europe because Europe needs them, acutely needs them. But this is a sort of change in the relations of power. And immigrants know this. They know that they are needed. They know that the local economies need them. And so they can demand more in terms of social benefits, for example. Nothing shocking here, but difficult to accept for countries that are used to regard immigrants as second-class citizens. Now, we would have to accept them as first-class citizens, or then, obviously, conflict between immigrants and the majorities in Europe are more or less inevitable. I see this very clearly in Portugal, which is an interesting example, and maybe I'll finish with this. Why is Portugal suddenly receiving waves of Bangladeshi and Pakistani immigrants? We decided when I was in government that we had to upgrade our economic model and become better at exports. Part of exports is tourism, export of services. Portugal upgraded its tourism industry dramatically. High-scale tourism, some of the most expensive, most luxurious hotels are opening now in Portugal, all over Portugal. At the same time, young Portuguese were moving to London, Amsterdam, Stockholm. They are working in the hospitality industry, many of them. They're making 5 times what they would make in Portugal working in a hotel, or 10 times more. But then how are you going to operate a services industry without labor? It's labor-intensive industry, so you have to bring up, in a rather organized way, immigrants from Bangladesh and Pakistan. But then, these immigrants are coming no longer in a position of dependence. It's not a favor that is being made to them. It's our acute economic need for immigration. I think that sense, which even the far right is aware of, is part of the reason that immigration has become so difficult. It's not the presence of immigrants among us. It's the sense, first, that they no longer respect us. Second, as the previous panel discussed, that perhaps they will even prosper and thrive in our communities. Perhaps there will be 20% of Muslims. Perhaps there will be 30% of Muslims. And then what happens to us? Someone spoke in the previous panel, I think it was Christian, about how this is a quickly shrinking majority. And I think that would be the way that I would summarize some of these developments. What we have is a quickly shrinking hegemon. And the deep psychological dynamics that creates, both of the level of a sense of loss of control, but then a very dangerous spiral where you react to the loss of control by exchanging your views of a legitimate form of political power with political power that no longer relies on legitimacy. And that most likely, I would say, will not work as advertised. You know, my fundamental belief as a political scientist is that the best form of power is legitimate power, is power that is accepted. A form of power that is illegitimate, is widely seen as illegitimate, is a much weaker form of power. So Donald Trump is fundamentally wrong when he thinks that being tough and not caring about norms is going to increase American power. It's tempting to react that way. But we've entered a spiral where we are undermining our own power, becoming weaker. As we become weaker, we have a greater sense of loss of control. As we have a greater sense of loss of control, we undermine our own power further. It's a destructive dynamic that in many ways, I would argue, mimics the kind of destructive dynamics you've seen all over the world in the 2 centuries where Western power was on the up. And I'll finish here with 22 minutes. I think that's what you want.
Great job. Thanks, guys, both of you. Thank you. All right, not bad for the 4th and final session in the afternoon. If you need coffee, feel free to Adult Learning. Get it any time. We'll break in just a short bit. Let's start off with Maureen Kahn from the Time. Wow, the wall. Wow. Why don't we just serve the coffee to the table, and just keep it going.
Thank you. I just ended up finding myself agreeing with everything Bruno said. So it's probably going to be a comment with some questions. And on what's changed, so we mentioned York Haider. Frieda's mentioning York Haider a lot in the first session. So in 2000, when York Haider, has enough political might to be in a coalition government in Austria, Louis Michel, then Charles Michel's father, Sir Charles Michel, recently departed European Council President. Louis Michel is Belgium's foreign minister and brings to the European table a genuine move to kick Austria out of the European Union. That was how much the far right's entry into power was seen as existential for the European Union, and how the idea of a far right EU, which we're increasingly talking about, was so far away at the turn of the century. So that's what's changed. And I think, Natalie, you said that the offer from the centre to the extreme right was that we will be a moderating force on you. Instead, they have ended up being an extreme force on us and pushing the centre to the right. And this possibility was always talked about around the 2015-16 moment, where Orban's reverse takeover of the EU was spoken about. And what surprised me was how easily it happened. He pushed at an open door. It wasn't a hostile takeover in any senses, actually, because who put up the resistance? And I would argue a bit like Bruno, the reason we don't have the energy or the ideological ability to counter the Orbans of this world is because we're scared, very scared of the rest of the world, and we don't know who we are anymore. So it comes from a sense of insecurity. We're scared of Africa, we're scared of China, we're scared of Trump, we're scared of everybody else's favorable demographics, we're scared about our sharing a relatively shrinking share of global GDP. We look at the fact that Italians might not exist in 100 years' time, all of this stuff, we're petrified. So given that these two developments, the very not hostile, pretty easy Orban takeover of the European Union, or whatever you want to call it, has happened without so much resistance, is very much dependent on the fact that externally we don't know who we are. So we need to go with these strong guys because maybe they've just got it right. And let's just get into bed with them, because what the hell else have we got to offer? So the socialists don't stand up for a non-far right EU, the Greens don't. There's nobody there if you want to turn to ideologically to change that vision of Europe. So what does a far right EU look like, I guess, in the world? And then so Bruno you're speaking about the kind of this increase in power, brute power and chauvinism, and it's happening everywhere. And I guess the one country we probably haven't spoken about in these last 2 days is what's happening in India. And Modi's offer to the Indian people. And again, relying on an ancient sense of what Hindustan is, about what it means to be an Indian, erasing hundreds of years of the Muslim presence in the country, calling it an aberration, appealing to a sense of restoring dignity to Indians. So you have all these competing chauvinisms. And the thing with Modi's kind of brand is that it kind of fits quite well with some of the versions that we're doing in Europe, especially when it comes to the Muslim problem. So anyone who's tweeted anything about Islamophobia in Europe will realize the first bots that you get underneath are Indians, right? Either coming at you, holding you up as the problem, disseminating or attacking you, whatever. So I'd be interested in that kind of relationship about how these other chauvinisms can actually help feed into ours. So it's not just about European nationalists co-opting with each other, but also finding sources of legitimacy for their own prejudices outside of Europe. And India is very appealing because they're brown people who also hate Muslims. So that kind of is quite useful from a sort of acceptability point of view. And then I guess really finally, there is an attempt to go back to the global south and to give them an offer, a better offer. And this is the offer that we say, you know, those Chinese people who are getting interbedded, you don't even know what you're signing when you sign those loan agreements, right? That they're actually going to rip you off, that they're pretty rapacious, that they're not going to take haircuts when it comes down to it, that you don't know what you're doing. This is an incredibly patronizing attitude. I don't think it's one that works. But we go in there and we say, we can give you a better offer, because you know us and we know you. We might be the old colonial enemy, but ultimately we're kind of, where there's a familiarity here. Is any of this working? Or is it actually just entrenching the fact that we just are so boneheaded about how to deal with the rest of the world when it comes to coming up with the rival Chinese offer? And is there any attempt at getting whatever offer we can do to make it a little bit more palatable for these countries? Or as you said, Natalie, are we just frankly fucked up so bad that there's no way of putting this back in the box?
Just three quick remarks. I mean, firstly, I was actually really intrigued by Bruno's explanation to this centre-right, far-right dynamic, because I think you're absolutely right. I mean, sort of going back to the 1990s and Haider and Austria, and the argument back then was, exactly, sort of the cordon sanitaire was kind of very, very strong. And then you kind of go through the motions of what has happened. And at times you're really bewildered by the fact that, every time there isn't that moderation. I mean, that moderation doesn't happen. I mean, Haider was a little lamb compared to Kickle in many respects, right? So that there's no such moderation and government doesn't moderate. And what indeed does happen is this, movement to the far right of the centre. I was intrigued, though, by Bruno's explanation as to why, because, one explanation is basically this is kind of, Einstein's definition of folly, right? I mean, keep on repeating the same thing, expecting a different outcome. Bruno's explanation, though, that I hadn't actually considered, I think is really disturbing, is actually there isn't this incredible ontological difference between these people. And we make more out of the difference than there actually is. I mean, he's perhaps stretching the argument a little bit too much, but I think there's something there that we should...
I think the difference was we used to call them anti-Europeans, and that was the worst thing you could have called anyone. And now they're not so much anti-European.
No.
We don't have anything to kind of go with that ideologically.
Yeah.
Because now they're not anti-Europe. What exactly do we disagree?
Well, that's the thing, because it's like, well, exactly. Well, they have, there's a story about them becoming more sophisticated, but there's also a story of the others becoming more radicalized, because all of a sudden, I mean, it's very, again, I go back to, an Italian, sort of, I'm looking at Mattias, he knows this. How often do we find, sort of leaders on the centre left of the centre right saying, no, all we have to do is go to Brussels and bang our fists on the table and we're going to get more. So, I mean, in a sense, there's been a movement throughout the political spectrum. The second thing that I wanted to touch on is this point that you made about Modi and India. And just a little anecdote there. I was in the room, big room, lots of people, when there was the sort of first love fest between Meloni and Modi. And it was really on a kind of human psychological level, it's actually quite striking. Because, it was her first non-European international trip. And, she was still in the early days of her government, and she had a kind of, written out speech, and she was reading. And then all of a sudden, she lifted her gaze, and he was sitting in front of her, and they looked at each other, and you could see the little hearts, And it was indeed all about culture and identity and our roots and ancient civilizations, and you could really see how that clicked. So indeed, I think often, but then I turn this question to Bruno, because his explanation is, well, and I think there's something to it, but I think the India example shows that maybe it's not just that. Because if your explanation, Bruno, is, well, the reason why this is happening is because there's a global decline. So if that were the case, then we would only be seeing this in the West, whereas we're also seeing it in India, in Brazil, so there's something there, which, yeah.
So a global decline from a position of hegemonic power. You can afford to be liberal in the 1995 meaning of the word if you're the hegemon. Now, if you decline from hegemony, you're going to adopt a very different language. But it can be the language that both Meloni and Modi adopt, because neither of them is an hegemon. They are in the arena. They are in this jungle where everything is very competitive, and they have to adopt a different kind of language. I think this attraction that Western leaders suddenly have for particularly Asian leaders has to do a lot with the sense that perhaps they understand power better. And in a way it's true, because they understand that they have a more cynical approach to political power because they've been for 2 centuries under the boot of European colonialism. So they are much more disenchanted, much more cynical, much more centered in protecting ourselves and our own identity. So when there is a leveling and European power and Indian power start to approach each other in terms of metrics that you want to use, then the languages are also starting to converge, and you may even have phenomena where European leaders admire, learn, perhaps even try to imitate, if in some cases, leaders from Asia, because they realize that approach fits the times better. So that's, I think, of course, then there are other issues, but my answer to Marine would be that that's why you find this sort of affinity, because in fact, the affinity results from the fact that we are roughly in the same place now. We're not above India, and we can't afford to be magnanimous in the way. Sometimes I ask myself if liberalism in the end is just magnanimity. It's just the generosity that is proper of those who have a lot of power and don't have to worry about their power. If it's, instead of being a theory and a political philosopher, isn't just like a habit of mind of those who are powerful.
Great. All right, let's get 1 or 2 more questions, then we'll take a break. Simon Cooper with Financial Times. Hit that button, Simon, if you would.
Sorry, we're struggling here. We've done it. Hi. 2 excellent talks. Thank you very much. I was very intrigued by this idea that we're like the Hawaiians when Captain Cook arrives, that we're weak, we don't have much of an economy, we don't have many useful weapons, we don't have the high technology. He has the ship, we don't have a ship, he has cannons. And so that's us now. And the far right kind of has an answer, which is, if you just keep the world out in the form of migrants, then we can kind of still be here on our island. And the other parties don't have an answer, because Draghi says, we can completely rebuild our economies with enormous investment, which everyone knows is not going to happen. And we're not going to fight wars. We've shown that in Ukraine. So the rest of us, we just don't really have any answer. And what we're hoping is, let's stay in Hawaii and hope that the ships keep sailing by. And maybe they see us and they wave at us, but they don't bother with us because we don't really matter anymore. So is that it? Is that the far right they're the only people with some kind of answer to the European predicaments, or what?
Very, very quick. There would be a very healthy, and I think a response, and I think a rational response would be to accept that we live in a world where there are many different poles of power, and influence is going to flow in both directions, not just in one direction. But I thought you were trying to actually be a little that you're mocking my
no,
because I didn't quite say we're Hawaii in the sense that we're not collapsing to the complete lack of power. Although psychologically, we may sometimes put ourselves in that position, but the reality of the matter is that, again, we continue to be more powerful than India. So
We
the
have
rational, healthy-
15% of global GDP.
Yeah.
It's going to be less and less and less every year.
Less and less, but again, we are not in the position of the colonized when they were colonized. We are in the position of the colonizers that are no longer colonizers. And the rational reaction would be just to accept that. So we can then develop how difficult this is and how to do it. But the brief answer is that no, I don't think, I think there is another response where you share power with others. Why is that so difficult to share power with others? But it just seems very difficult for us.
One other?
Oh, why is it? I'll come back to that.
But on the on your question, Simon, I think the part of the problem, I think you're absolutely right. You know, so the far right has a solution, if you like, and the rest actually doesn't. The problem is that because there is this deep conviction amongst the others that maybe are not so different after all, that solution is not a solution. Actually, what our solution is, and I think France is really the best example, is wait for them to fail. Wait for the far right to fail. And so actually there isn't a lot of thinking in terms of what the alternative solution is all about. Just let them have a go at it. And it goes back to this issue of let them enter government. And maybe at some point it happens, I don't know, but it seems not to have happened yet, right?
Well, they have crap solutions and we have no solutions, so it's not a very high-level competition.
No, exactly. No, but we don't even try to find the solution because our solution is to let them fail.
Yeah, and then we just keep going back.
And
to
then
what went
exactly,
wrong.
yeah.
And we've created the most livable societies in human
Of course,
history. So
and
it
it's
sort
all
of is
great.
Hawaii in that sense.
Yeah. We can afford to wait.
We press and do one more question, then we'll take a break. Sebgil from...
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning North Korea troops, but I think that it's important to mention also that North Korean troops are fighting in Ukraine, not against Ukraine and Ukrainian army, but for my opinion, mostly against Western ideology, Western world. And I also want to mention here that now we have two nuclear states that are fighting against Ukraine, and we didn't mention a nuclear threat during this session. And I think this is kind of an elephant in the room while I'm speaking about it. So let's just imagine that tomorrow Ukraine will sign something, will have a ceasefire, kind of security guarantees, maybe another one, Budapest Memorandum that we had in 1994. Then Trump will weaken NATO. And what signal it will bring to other countries in the world, actually, and maybe Europe. So my question is, do you think that it will actually bring us to more divided Europe in terms of security coalitions? People will not trust NATO anymore, and they will think about nuclear threat. And also there will be more countries inside Europe and outside. They will think more about kind of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons as a deterrence against like such countries as North Korea, and how it actually will shape a political landscape in Europe.
So I think that before we get to Europeans reconsidering nuclear, we would have to go through so many. I don't see that happening.
You don't see?
No, I don't see that happening yet. I see something else happening, probably quite soon. So I see a dynamic whereby, there is, an offer, sort of Trump-Putin offer. Then my question would be, does Putin pretend to take it or not? If he pretends to take it, which I think is the more likely option, then I see a fracturing of Europe. That's, I think, the predicament that we're in. because actually, sort of, Catherine, maybe just coming back to you, to me, the real question is what happens in Berlin in that scenario. Because if Berlin holds the line, then maybe that fracturing doesn't happen. If Berlin folds, I struggle to see France keeping the line, and certainly Italy will just be very happy to, So I see, in a sense, I think the real added value for Putin in pretending to accept that deal, it has really very little to do with Ukraine itself, and it has to do with ensuring a political divide in Europe. The other thing that I wanted to say, though, connected to the first part of your remarks, is that actually I think in retrospect, we made the mistake also in feeding this narrative of this being a global conflict. Because kind of framed in that way, and then of course exacerbated by the Middle East, we ended up being on the losing side. Had this been framed as, in many respects, what it is, this is a war of conquest in Europe. This is a kind of process of decolonization in Europe that has never quite finished. And, if it had been framed in those terms, then, Russia would have had a harder case to make, beframing it as a conflict between, in a sense, a kind of global East and global West, which then all of a sudden got conflated into a global South, global North. I think we were our own worst enemies in that respect. So I think we should be very cautious of that narrative.
Just very, very quickly, because we need to go to the break. But, for me, the history of the war in Ukraine so far is also a illustration of this decline of Western power. And this is what we have to admit, this is the problem. So we thought we could isolate Russia, collapse the Russian economy. We couldn't. Why? Not because we weren't tough enough, which is going to be the explanation now, but because the world economy has changed. And with growing markets in India, in China, and Indonesia that were open to Russian energy exports, Russia was always going to survive for a decade or more. Now, the reaction to this could be twofold. We could say we have to be tougher, and there are lots of people saying, let's go, let's bomb Moscow. Putin is weak. Now, Putin suddenly, who was always sometimes presented as a maniac, now is too weak to respond in any way. He will just collapse like a house of cards. I've been a very strong supporter of Ukraine throughout, but I have trouble joining this group which is actively now calling for this. The other solution would be to, we're not as strong as we used to be, so we have to work with other people. We have to work with India, with Indonesia, with China to try to isolate Russia. And if they want something in return, well, that gets us back to the question here. We have to realize that we can't call the shots anymore. And if we're going to want good outcomes, they're not going to be optimal for us. And this is also the answer to you, Nicholas. We want the outcomes to be optimal. We build a whole theory around ourselves that we deserve optimal outcomes all the time. And we can't accept any other outcome.
All right, well, just to name it, there is at your place an evaluation. It's short and sweet on purpose. We know everybody's got a million things to do, but particularly we'd welcome, please, maybe 3 names of people you think would be good to be part of future conferences like this in the future, should they emerge. That's the plan. And just a quick data point again, 6:30 the buses will leave from out front. So we'll have a break. Until then, be whisked off to a lovely restaurant about 20, 25 minutes away called La Choumerie. I'm missing something, Nicole. I can't remember. There's one more thing.
Departures tomorrow? No.
Nicole will be sending you your individual time for pickup, for departure back to the airport. Most of us tomorrow morning, but maybe some other times as well.
Dinner tonight's catch-all.
Dinner tonight's great. All right, and we've got, I think, 9 questions. So let's get to it, starting with Shadi Hamid from The Post.
Okay. Here we go.
Oh, very good. Thanks. Yeah, so maybe it's just my American patriotic instinct that is being triggered a little bit with Bruno's comments, but I did want to just make more of a distinction between who we're talking about when we say we in the West. I know that we're Faith Angle Europe and the focus of this panel is on Europeans, but if we're talking about the West, then obviously the US is pretty important here. And I think the idea of the US being a quickly shrinking hegemon or losing power in this kind of very substantial way doesn't hold quite as much, certainly in economic terms. And, I think it's been well covered by now just how successful the US economy has been vis-a-vis Europe over the past 15 years. And just as a reminder for folks, the EU's overall GDP and America's overall GDP in 2008 were both around 14 trillion. Today, America's has doubled to around 27 trillion, and the EU GDP is basically the same at like 15 trillion. So the US has now opened up almost a 90% gap in overall GDP with the entire EU. The other point I would make has to do with a longer term structural issue, which is fertility rates. Europe has lower fertility rates than the US, but not by a whole lot. But the one advantage that the US has is that we can maintain or exceed our population through immigration in a way that Europe, with its current anti-immigrant policies, won't be able to do. But this also, I think, relates to the US vis-a-vis Asia. And if we're looking at sort of comparative power there, China won't be able to sustain economic growth for the simple reason it doesn't have enough people. Its fertility rate is 1.1, which is almost half of the replacement rate. And China has no way to replenish people or import them because it's a xenophobic, autocratic country that can't make non-citizens into citizens. So I think that I would just be curious, Bruno, how you would reflect on those two, I think, pretty big factors and certainly the built-in advantage that the US has in that regard. So I totally take your point that Europe is a declining power and has been declining for quite some time. And some of you may have seen like that whole FT piece about how if Britain was a US state, it would be poorer than Mississippi. I thought that was kind of mean. But still, I mean, I think there is like a very striking difference in this regard. So I'd just be curious how you would respond to that.
I think, Shadi, that there's a lot of American mythology here.
Okay.
To be blunt, and we could go through all of it. But those figures, as far as I know, and as far as I've seen criticisms of them, have a lot to do with currency exchange. The dollar appreciates, suddenly it looks like American GDP has. I think if you control for a number of things, you're not going to get those results. I'm not surprised that Europe is declining compared to the US because, I mean, the US feels more in need to be less generous with Europe. I think over the past 20 years, Europeans have started to feel the brunt of American power in terms of, there's no space anymore. There was a lot of space for our car manufacturers in the 60s and 70s. America accepted that. Somehow there was no space for our internet economy, and it doesn't exist. And we have an American internet economy in Europe. But I don't think this in the long term is going to be good for the US. China, this is where I think there are a lot of American mythologies around China. I've even given up. You probably may have noticed when we first talked, I was very interested in China, but I kind of given up on trying to fight some of these mythologies, also because you're then attacked of being a Sinophile, and I prefer to be attacked for other things. But, China's doing well. It's difficult to transition from a low-value manufacturing economy to a high-value manufacturing economy. It's extremely difficult. But if you take that into account, why then, if the US is so dominant, why is China entering all these markets? There are clearly technologies of the future, EVs, green energy. Why is there so much anxiety in the US? Why is the US so obsessed about bringing down China? Why is Gina Raimondo saying we have to slow down China's innovation rate? She actually said that, we have to slow down China's innovation rate. If the US is so powerful, why do you see the Ukraine war developing as it is? US didn't even try to stop imports of Russian energy by India. Why didn't they try? Because they knew if they tried, they would upset the Indians, they would upset Modi. Modi would suddenly be sending some signals that he was open to talking to Xi, and so on. So it's a global landscape that reflects the decline of American power. Whereas in 2008, if Putin had decided to invade Ukraine in 2008, a large-scale invasion, I think it's pretty easy to guess that the Russian economy would have collapsed. There would be bank runs. And that, I think, is why Putin didn't do it. So as opposed to Fukuyama, let us say, that thought the Ukraine war was the very last stage of the end of history before the very end of history, I think the Ukraine war actually reflects that decline of American power. But I'm not talking about a collapse. It's just a relative decline. But the thing is, stopping being an hegemon is already so significant, particularly from a psychological point of view, that we don't even have to introduce ideas of collapse. Just the sense that you can't impose your will anymore. But big question, I'll come back to it.
Well, we got to get to John Decker for one more hit. So let's just see. Let's go first to the American power thing. Maybe it's not just quite over yet. How about Emma Goldberg from the New York Times?
Thank you so much. This has been so fascinating. I guess this is kind of linked to Shadi's, but I was just curious about like the dismissal of some of the economic anxieties, which it feels like are a lot of times very much linked with cultural anxieties. Like when people don't feel that they have a stable future they can envision for their families, they're much more susceptible to being, to their sense of identity feeling unmoored. And I also think, like Bruno, to your point about the people who, for example, oppose Trump sounding more and more like Trump and how that extends more globally, there's always been certain people to whom like no rules applied, which is like the mega wealthy, who have also kind of often existed as if like borders were irrelevant and like they really had no country of origin. And I think that like sense of hypocrisy is very obvious to people, that there are these people who like their level of opulence and the incredible level of wealth that exists right now kind of exposes like the hypocrisy in people across the political spectrum, not holding them to account. And I was thinking about you mentioning like Vivek Ramaswamy being part of that meme of the populist leaders. Like there are these the billionaires of the world who are considered like now almost sort of like political figures. Yeah. And so I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about what role is there for the economic analysis in this.
Can I just sort of start off, because then it also connects to a point that I wanted to make to Shadi's comment. Obviously the economic explanation is important. I mean, the whole story of the US election has a lot to do, obviously, with the economy. I guess what I'm saying is that what has happened in the last, sort of 2-3 years reveals the fact that it's insufficient as an explanation. And therefore, and this is the disturbing thing, there isn't an obvious answer. If you get the economy wrong, then what you do is you rethink it, you try and get it right, and there is a solution to the problem. Because in a sense, there has been a lot of that soul searching, right? After 2016, there was this sense of, the establishment has to rethink and, sort of hyperliberalism, globalization and inequality. And so it's not as if we haven't had that conversation. It's not as if nothing has happened. Some things have been done to try and address that. Now, obviously, a lot more should be done. But I guess that the political trend, especially these waves, suggests that there's something else there. And the disturbing thing is that something else has a lot to do with identity, culture, and psychology. I think the psychology bit and the anxiety that it generates, and this relates to, I think, the point that Shadi, the question that you were making. Obviously, there's a big difference between the US and Europe. However, these are both stories of decline in different ways. In the European case, it's a story of absolute decline. However, you could say, well, in terms of the hegemony story, Europe has kind of gone past the point of thinking it's a hegemon for quite some time. Yeah. So the psychological impact of a relative decline in the US, and I think the story that Bruno's painting is one of relative decline, psychologically, that is, you could say that, in absolute terms, the absolute decline is in a sense more, quote unquote, existential, which is probably why these kind of, cultural, the migration angle, why it kind of resonates in some respects more in Europe than in the United States. But the psychological impact of a relative decline and is actually harder to swallow, I think.
So the billionaires, I've seen on social media the last 2 days, many people, including friends of mine in the US, being, as they said, for the first time, very optimistic about the US. Because now you're going to have people like Musk and Thiel in charge of policy. And they are going to remove all the regulatory impediments. And within five years, America is going to be growing 10% a year and will be on Mars, and everyone will live forever. Now, I don't know. Let's see. But what I do know is that if you saw this phenomena happening elsewhere in another country, you would portray it as an acute sign of political decay when oligarchs and billionaires are taking over policy. And again, maybe I'm wrong, but I tend to think the kind of state that the US had, where national goals are pursued in articulation of the private market, where an international global system is seen as an index of power and you try to preserve that system rather than exercising your power directly. This seemed to work very well for the US over 100 years. So I think, the proof, the onus of proof should be on the people who think that, let's try something completely different. Let's destroy the American political system, let's put billionaires in charge, let's destroy the global system and let's exercise power directly. Will this work? We were convinced it doesn't. Now, should we revise all our theories? I still think that I still see this as a sign of decline more than anything else. Jury is out, but I can't believe that having Musk in charge behind the scenes is a sign that the American regime is being rejuvenated.
Just real quick, because Bono has a chalet in Ez, and we worked to maybe try to get him here yesterday with Ndidi. Of course, he did the book Surrender, which talks a lot about faith. I think it would be great for some future faith angle Europe, but we'll just see what happens. But he has a wonderful story on this topic of billionaires, which is that in the United States, when one walks along a corridor and looks up the hill and sees a beautiful mansion, they typically say, I could be that guy someday. In Ireland, when you walk along the corridor and you see a mansion on a hill, you say to yourself, I'm going to get that bastard. So different view. Maybe our view of billionaires is part of that. Guillermo from El País.
Thank you. I find both your intervention as good as depressing, and I want to be a little more depressed. So I'm going to ask you some conclusion. When you say that the masks are off, and in the second wave of illiberalism or national populism, it's coming and triumphant. What you will say is the concrete agenda now? I mean, anti-climate change, anti-feminism, reaction to Me Too, everything. I mean, anti-immigrant, anti-Islam. And second, when we imagine a free country and a dictatorship, I think a lot of time we think in the model of the 30s. I mean, like fascist regime with concentration camps and a liberal regime. But Viktor Orban has invented something in the middle, also in Poland, maybe in the state, hope no. Can we imagine a lot of European countries falling in this where, I mean, if you don't get in trouble, it's okay, but if you are in a minority, if you are not the majority religion, you can be in problems. And also, in referring to the European Union, I mean, I think the Brexit is no more the model. The model is maybe coming back 30 years without, I don't know if without the euro, but without Schengen. If I'm not wrong, Germany suspended Schengen. I don't know if there is again in here 30 kilometers from here in Ventimiglia there is real controls. I mean, I don't know if France and Italy has suspended Schengen, but in fact it's suspended. So coming back to an age where European Union was more a place for economic interchange and not real political project of an early union.
So, I mean, on the first question, I mean, the mask coming off and what does this mean? I mean, I think this relates to this kind of, question that often is asked, sort of fascism, what does fascism mean today? I mean, what does fascism mean in the 21st century? Well, I would say it is about the centralization of power. It's about the erosion of checks and balances. It's about the erosion of media freedoms. It's about following a socially conservative agenda. It's obviously anti-migration and the Islamophobia and you take all of those criteria, and there are certainly many parties, many leaders, and increasingly more and more governments in power that tick all of those boxes. Now, the question then becomes, how do they tick the boxes? And how is this agenda pursued? And I think that the distinction is between smart fascists and stupid fascists. And normally the more stupid ones tend to be more in your face, more abrupt. The smarter ones, and actually Orban is one of them, because as I said, when he first came to power, it wasn't so obvious that he was going to turn out this way. So the smarter ones pursue the boiling frog kind of strategy. And so to me, the question is not what does the snapshot of today look like, but what is the trend? So I go back to the Meloni example. What is the trend there? Is the trend towards moderation? No. The trend is moving to the right. It's not moving to the center. And it's about getting the center towards the right. I think we see this, as I said, sort of time and time again, but because we just focus on the snapshot and we say, well, I mean, this is not 1939, surely. But I mean, maybe it's 1922. And it takes time and it changes gradually, but look at the trend. How does this then impact the EU? Is it about returning to the 1970s? Early 80s? I wish. I'm not sure it's that at all. I think it's true that the EU, as we know it, is very much the product of 1986 and the single market, and in a sense it fit into a neoliberal age. But even the EU in its origins, so the EU of the 1960s and 70s was a liberal project, if what we understand by liberalism is understanding things like openness as being a good thing. And the agenda of these movements and parties and governments is a closed agenda. It's an illiberal agenda. And whereas the state, an illiberal nation state can survive, a fascist state can exist, right? Certainly existed in Europe, can exist again. A fascist European Union is a contradiction in terms. It will simply implode and cease to exist. And we may keep on calling it a European Union, but it's going to be something radically different, right? I mean, it's not going to be it anymore. But we're not going to see it die because it won't die with a crash. It will die silently. And I think this is the scenario that we're in.
Just 10 seconds. Just to go back to something that Marine said that I think is relevant here. So she mentioned this accusation of being anti-European. And perhaps the accusation is used less, but it's also changed its meaning because the word European has changed its meaning in these 10 years. It used to mean that if you're anti-European, you're anti the open society, you're anti a certain cosmopolitan outlook, universalist principles, multilateralism. Being called anti-European meant that. Now being anti-European, we're still in the process where this transformation is happening. It's not concluded, but being anti-European now means you're against us, you're perhaps on their side, you're not culturally aligned with our continent, and so on and so forth. The meaning is almost reversed. This is the strange thing. We continue to use the accusation, but we mean at some point within 10 more years, we might mean the exact opposite of what it meant in 2015.
Let's go to John Decker, White House correspondent for Gray Television.
Thanks, Josh. Bruno, Natalie, thank you so much for your presentations. I really enjoyed them. And Natalie, I wanted to ask you to expand on something that you mentioned that you, I think, alluded to expanding upon. Just wanted to remind you, it's about the Pope and the Pope, his involvement in the war in Ukraine, his decisions that he's made as it relates to that. Can you amplify on that a little bit, explain his motivations, why he's taken the positions that he's taken?
So this is my best guess. I really know I'm not in his head, but I think that everyone, Pope included, we're all human beings that come from a particular context, and he is a left-wing Argentinian, and his worldview is inevitably like all of ours, inevitably shaped by that. So I think he is naturally inclined to be anti-American, and therefore naturally inclined to buy into a narrative of Russia's invasion of Ukraine as being this is the product of NATO expansion. And I know for a fact that that his personal views are not reflected in the Vatican as such. I mean, I've had long conversations with people like, Parolin and Gallagher underneath him that, sort of privately will tell you that they're very embarrassed about it. And yet time and time again, and it's not as if they're not trying to sort of articulate this message to him, and yet every time that he has an opportunity, he will go back to this. Going as far as saying that actually, Russia has a proud imperial history, and actually there's nothing wrong with that. So there's no shame. There's deep conviction there. So I think this is really something that he genuinely believes in. And then there will be other things like the Middle East that he feels just as strongly about. But I think they are conditioned by exactly the same mind frame, which is that of being a left-wing Latin American, sort of anti-American human being.
Yeah.
Is he just one voice, or do you think that he has influence in terms of what happens in Ukraine?
So he has influence in the sense that he provided a moral cover for people that had, I think, the situation has morphed over time, but especially at the beginning where everyone just was so shocked at what Russia had done. You invade your neighbor in this way, violation of international law, all the rest of it. And all of a sudden you have this moral authority that legitimizes a different reading of it. And so for those that would kind of, pro-Russian deep down, but were kind of embarrassed of exposing their pro-Russian sentiment, they felt emboldened. And when you start having the popes equating peace with surrender, which he explicitly did, then all of a sudden talking about surrender is not such a bad thing anymore. So I think the distortion, especially of the word peace, and the role that the Pope played in distorting that word has enabled others that have totally different motives, basically, to become far more open about their positions.
Just as a quick footnote to that, I think that's true. I think there's also an ecumenical dimension. The Pope's very committed to building relationships with Russian Orthodoxy.
Absolutely, and he invested a lot in that.
And it's a huge investment of time and energy in that, and so he's not willing to sacrifice that for this. So I think you're right. There is, but I think that there's a very crucial religious institutional story here, and the very complicated. You're all know better than me, but the kind of complicated history of Catholicism in Ukraine. There's a very strong religious story which I don't think is often told, which is shaping a lot of this.
But can I say something to this? Because I get that. What it still doesn't explain to me is why don't you just shut up? Just don't talk. I understand that you're not going to become super pro-Ukraine. Just zip. Yeah. And the fact that there's no zip suggests to me that there's something that is felt kind of in the gut that goes beyond that rational, in a sense, explanation.
Yeah.
How do you think that's, can I just ask, how do you think that's different from the previous Pope in the Iraq War? The Vatican has generally always said, you know, wars are bad. You think this takes it a step further and weighs in on this particular geopolitical issue more specifically than in past papacies with past wars involving America?
Yeah, I think to be honest, it does. I mean, I can't recall another case in which there has been, I mean, you know, sort of, you know, the Pope being against the Iraq War. So what is the solution of the Pope? Well, the US, get out, right? I mean, stop the war, get out. It is not stay and occupy and domesticate and pacify the situation by staying in, right? It is not take the Middle East, you know, it's not as if what the Pope has been saying now, but not just now, you know, Israeli-Palestinian conflict is basically saying, well, Israel, just go ahead, occupy, remain, use of force, fine, so long as, you know, I mean, sorry?
I don't know, is that the Vatican position? I don't know.
Well, I mean, if you start saying peace equals surrender and the Ukrainians should just stop fighting and stop resisting, I don't hear the Pope saying Palestinians should stop resisting. Yes, they obviously say they should stop resisting in violent, you know, through violence. But I think there's something different here.
Can we go to Mattia Ferrarisi?
Sure.
The Vatican and Rome, not so far away for you.
Right. Real quick on this, just to add one small thing, just because I reported on this, like I think it was interesting that the fact that the Pope relies a lot upon the advice of Jeffrey Sachs, for example, has been doing that for a long time. But I think I do agree with Natalie where his sort of gut feeling, gut instincts bring him there. But I think there are also people surrounding him that he chooses to be surrounded by are sort of advising him in a certain direction. But this is a side note. Thanks for the presentation. Two quick questions for both, especially for Natalie. I think the framing of the two waves, I'd like to push back a little bit on that, because then when you articulate that, it seems to me that it's like season 2 of the same TV series. So in a way, I don't want to be like picky about terminology per se, is that my question is, by framing that in different waves, aren't we sort of running the risk of thinking of those phenomenon as sort of glitches that we can sort of fix? And so then you have a glitch and then you try to fix, and then you got, for example, Biden being the good example, 2020, and think like, okay, this is done. I mean, that was an anomaly. That was like, we fixed a bug and then we move on, and then you have a different wave, as opposed to sort of recognize that in a more holistic way, like, okay, this is part of a broader thing. So I wonder whether framing it in a number of waves would like really help us sort of get sort of our fingers to the actual problem. The second thing that I had so many questions that now I can't remember really. It's one side note, but mostly it's more a comment. I don't know. It's about Trump. I have one thing. I'm wondering, following your narrative of the current sort of far-right populism in Europe, whether Trump is good news ultimately for those kind of movements, based on the characterization that I largely agree with that you gave us. And of course, the obvious answer is yes, Trump is emboldening those movements. At the same time, it seems to me that, as you said, and correct me if I understood it like in a wrong way, like the thing that these movements and these parties mostly need, especially when they go to government, is legitimization. And in some way, you can make the case that Trump being Trump and being Trumpian in any possible way is sort of like making them lose a little bit ground in their attempt to sort of like get within the system and sort of like get on the ground and sort of mix up and trying to squeeze people their side. So I'm wondering if you may see a sort of like a paradoxical backlash and having Trump as sort of like this huge big leader of this movement. One side note real quick about the moving people like in the center right moving from the far right has been said in many different ways. I'm not sure I completely agree with that, but I'm not asking for you an answer. It's just a thought I'm throwing there, because one way to see at this, to look at this thing, if you look at the agenda of, for example, the EPP 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it sounds to me it was a lot more extreme than it is now in many issues like abortion, immigration, family policy. They were trying to get the Christian roots written into Constitution. My idea here is that we're a little bit skewed by the expectation being rooted in a view in which you expect like a sort of like a progressive view of history, in which history is moving inevitably toward progress. And when you have like that kind of view of history, I don't know, that kind of view of history makes me a bit nervous when you have like a sort of, we're moving inevitably toward a certain kind of destiny that is gonna like produce this and that. And when they don't produce this and that, oh, this is far right. Whereas in terms of issues and policies, I do agree that Marine Le Pen and Ursula von der Leyen are overlapping on a lot of issues. Those issues are more to the right than it was the same parties 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Not sure about it, but that's just a thought.
So Matthew, on the waves, the framing, I meant it in two ways. One way is kind of, in a sense, very factual. Yeah, there has been a time in which these parties grew in support, and then they started declining. And then they grew again. So in this sense, it's a kind of factual wave. But then there's also the explanatory part of the wave thing. Yeah. So I remember, maybe this is just very personal, yeah, but I think when that first wave started declining, I said to myself, now, obviously, these kind of parties are still there, right? And they're going to be looking for a new kind of banner, right? And they tried a little bit with the kind of vaccines, and they didn't have too much traction. Like, it didn't really work. They're going to look for something else. And I was convinced, and actually I was partly right, and a big chunk of a book that I wrote in 2022 was about this. They're going to pick on climate. Because all of a sudden, by picking on climate and the just transition, and they can both bash the climate and bash the EU and bash liberalism and all the rest of it. And now, that is part of the story. But I think what I was looking for back then, and it goes back to the point about the economy, is for rational explanations, material explanations. And I guess my point now is that I think it's becoming obvious that that's important, but it's insufficient. And I don't think that we would be able to explain what has factually been a second wave if we just look at those material explanations. There's something else there that is harder to kind of grapple with. I think on your Trump actually possibly being a delegitimizer, I think that rests on the assumption that I wish it was correct, but I fear it's no longer correct, that Trump himself is considered so extreme and such kind of bad news that automatically being associated with him is delegitimizing. Just look at the reactions of the markets. I don't think that we're there anymore. I think that there is this, and it's not just Trump, yeah? I think there is this growing sense that you can have a far-right extreme agenda and actually be good news for the economy. If you had asked, I remember, back to a French example, in the run-up to the French parliamentary election, and especially in the run-up to the second round of the parliamentary election, I ended up having conversations with various investors that actually really hoped that out of the two extremes of having what they considered to be the far left and the far right, they would much have rather had Marine Le Pen. So if the assumption is sort of Trump delegitimizes because he's viewed as so extreme, well, the point is that if the whole spectrum has moved, he's no longer viewed as so extreme, and so he doesn't have that delegitimizing effect.
Just 10 seconds to say that, I used to go to those EPP breakfasts and meetings. I don't think it's the same EPP, and sometimes I don't recognize it, particularly on immigration. It was extremely tolerant, liberal, open. There were concerns, but never this anti-immigrant language that you have now. And even on other issues of China and other things, not blaming them. Again, I think it's contextual. The world, they will admit that they changed. They will just tell you. I talked to one prominent leader the other day. They will say the world changed and I changed with the world, or when the facts change, you have to change your mind. But you might also say that if you change so easily, then it wasn't really strong conviction to begin with.
Well said. Fareed Hafiz.
All right, thank you so much, both of you. It was a fascinating panel, and I think it was very much relatable to the panel we had before with Ruqayyah and myself. So I wanted to pick up something. First of all, I have a question for you, and I wanted to pick up on something that you said and kind of bring this discussion together and raise a question. Like, I really like this, when you refer to under some circumstances, van der Leyen is not so different to Le Pen. And you said there is something else going on. You clearly gave an idea of what that else could be. And I just wanted to raise a question because I found it interesting in a way, Natalie, that you gave the example of Viktor Orban. Now, Viktor Orban obviously is not a primary example of far-right populism in the sense of the political family, right? He was for a long time with the European People's Party. In that sense, he was center-right, Christian democratic, like a lot of his other folks in the EPP. And it's interesting in that sense because I feel like in the European discussion, we like to pin towards Viktor Orban, saying this is the bad guy. He speaks about the liberal democracy and puts all of these very blatantly, what you problematized here. But then I asked the question, because one of the things you raised was, like, this is about a civilizational and not a national project. And I remember an essay that was written by a friend of mine, Matti Bunzel, an anthropologist, and he made in 2005 the argument that one of the basic differences between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia was that anti-Semitism was basically about the purity of the nation state, versus Islamophobia is basically the idea of a European project of cultural hegemony for the Christian white identity. And the examples that he gave were not necessarily only in regards to the far right, but he was actually picking up on some very centrist politicians. And this is where I would like to raise a question and maybe introduce something again that I already talked about, but not so extensively, which is the absence in all of our analysis and discussion of race. Now, Aimé Césaire, in the 1950s, the anti-colonial author, wrote this in the Discourse on Colonialism. He argued that the worst thing that the Europeans will never forgive Adolf Hitler was that he did a genocide on European soul, on white people. Now, I don't want to get into the debate of Jews and whiteness, but the main argument that he made was basically the crime that was committed was bringing the colonial experience from the colonial times that were committed vis-a-vis so many of the colonized populations to European soil. And I wonder, in a lot of the discussion that we had here, because when we speak about immigration, when we speak about keeping those people out of power, when we're speaking about diversification of the society, we ultimately speak about people from the global south who are not white. Like, even if we say Polish folks in the UK, not considered they're like white but not quite white, but in the majority we're speaking about brown, black subjects. And I wonder, to what extent is this what you're describing here, in fact, a crisis of whiteness? Because it's something that we also see in the United States, right, with Trump and everything that happens with immigration, etc. Not the geopolitical context, obviously, that you were starting with in the first place, but in terms of how do we conceptualize this crisis that is going on here? Is it a crisis of whiteness? A crisis of whiteness in the sense of the shrinking hegemony, as you put it, not in the geopolitical sense, but in the sense of It is that group of people that feels that we are losing something. And obviously, in a European context, it's always easy to say, well, that's the third party, that's the far-right populists. But to what extent are like a lot of the centrist parties, center-right parties specifically, with some of them having a fascist background and fascist past, fascist roots, to what extent is this sort of, reconnecting to those sorts of very authoritarian, if not totalitarian roots that we are seeing popping up again in a different way, clearly in a much more articulate way, presenting themselves as defending liberal democracy. And just to give one example, the German state, German security apparatus has this, and I found that very, very much, speaking to what you were talking about. They have this concept of wehrhafte Demokratie, defensive democracy. Now, the defensive democracy is in fact hollowing out democracy from within. And it's very much this idea of, well, actually, we are defending democracy, but in reality, if you go it all the way along, there won't be any democracy left if you follow that path. But it's a very mainstream concept. What I want to say, this is not a far-right thing. It's institutionalized in the center of the state power.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say one thing about Orban and then relate it to race and going through with the link actually being Ukraine. I often ask myself, if Orban was not the outlier so far, and it may change, on Ukraine, would he have been demonized in the same way? Probably. So would he have been such a pariah around the European Council if it had only been about being a bigoted, sort of anti-rule of law, separation of powers, Probably not. I mean, yes, obviously there was still the whole thing, rule of law and Article 7 and Poland and Hungary, but it wasn't elevated to that level until Ukraine, until Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Hungary's positioning and Orban's positioning on this. And so the question then becomes, if, and it goes back to the transatlantic sort of part of the story, if that changes as a consequence of the US changing on Ukraine, then all of a sudden, the main reason why he was such an outlier, given that everything else is important but not that important because it's a question of shades of grey with others, and increasingly there are more and more joining, in a sense, the crowd, then all of a sudden, this is where I come back to the urbanization story. On the point of race, I mean, it has been sort of often asked, and I don't think there's a definitive answer to this, but yes, I mean, I do think that this has a lot to do with it, frankly speaking. I mean, how else can you explain the way in which, sort of Europeans welcomed Ukrainian refugees and the totally different attitude that they had towards other refugees. And not just in terms of the sheer numbers of it, which, you can explain more at the level of, in a sense, state policy, but also on a community level. Think about how many families, I mean, including my own, hosted Ukrainian refugees. And if I have to be completely honest with myself, did I do it when there was when there was a civil war in Syria? I did not. I think we would be dishonest with ourselves if we dismissed it. I don't mean to say that it's the only explanation, but I think one has to be honest in facing up to this.
Quickly on Orban, I think Natalie's entirely right. Orban got the civilizational borders wrong. And in a world of civilizations, that's the worst crime you can commit. You got the borders wrong. You're even potentially a traitor to our civilization by identifying our civilizational enemy with ourselves. Now, this discourse is not exclusive to Orban. 2019, Macron said the following: "Today, the biggest threat to humanism is authoritarian regimes, but also political religious ideology. The rise of radical political Islam is undoubtedly the foremost enemy of European humanist values, which are based on the free and rational individual, equality between women and men, and emancipation." Now, this is the time I came to the attention of of a journalist in Brussels called Marion Kahn when I was criticizing Macron about this. I find this unacceptable. Is he criticizing terrorism, or is he criticizing a civilization as a whole and defining it as a civilizational enemy? He says foremost enemy. He doesn't even try to say adversary. It's a Schmittian language that, to be honest to Macron, he has retreated a bit from. I think he realized that he was maybe poorly advised. But, just a way of saying that this is really, from that time, from 2019, become quite common in Europe and quite mainstream, and certainly not confined to what we define as the far right.
We're virtually at time. Do we have one more question? Is that okay? We give about 5 more minutes and then we wrap. I think we go to Katrin Benhold from the New York Times. Oh, even better. Look at that. Manners. The kindness. All right. Make it a good short zinger.
Mine is actually quite short.
Hit that button, though. Hit that button.
Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. I just wanted to quickly hit on the connection between the far-right movements and Russia. And it's interesting because you mentioned climate as becoming one big campaign issue that all of these different groups, in addition to migration, agree on. And of course, fossil fuels, oil and gas being the main revenue source for Putin. I mean, there are alliances that are economic and otherwise, and that are quite far-reaching. On that topic, I wonder, in the context of this conversation, Natalie in particular, what do you think? I mean, before the war, it felt like we had a Russia policy, and it was a very wrong one, but we had a Russia policy. We didn't have a Ukraine policy. Today, we have a Ukraine policy, and we don't have a Russia policy. I think that's the problem. So I would love us all to start thinking about what our Russia policy should be, and maybe not be too shy about thinking strategically here as well, and not be shy about thinking about this theory of, whether NATO expansion possibly contributed to alienating or giving Putin, means of manipulation, let's put it that way, because it is so incredibly powerful all across the world, from the Vatican to China to India, wherever you talk, and Eastern Europe, Germany. So what is our Russia policy? And do we need to tell a different story? What is our security architecture in that region? Can we bring Russia back in the fold? Like, what do you think?
And Nicholas, you getting in on this
Yeah.
or no? Yeah?
Okay, sorry, really quick. I thought it was, I took some comfort from hearing you because it was the first, sorry. I took a little bit of comfort from hearing you both speak because it was the first time I ever felt a kind of sigh of relief that Brexit happened. Maybe it did take the wind out of the sails a bit of the far right. But yeah, there is, I guess, that same question that Bruno said he was going to answer. Why does Europe find it so difficult to accept others? If, in hindsight, the 1990s, when we believed in multicultural societies, could look a bit like a blip if you're both right. And we're going back to an old Europe which finds it really hard to accept others. And other societies can do it, through good times and bad. And the Ottoman model of kind of devolution to different communities, ethnic or religious, is interesting, and Europe just really struggles with that. And I kind of wanted you to have an explanation as to why.
Maybe you won't be fully satisfied by the answer. I think, I didn't say Europe has a hard time. I said the West as a whole. US has a hard time. It's centuries of the kind of dominance that has never existed in human history before, because it was based on fundamental revolutions in technological power. And so we are, for the first time, experiencing a retreat from that. It's a peak of power based on technological innovations, which then get diffused. I think this is new in human history, and although I find sometimes the reactions quite pathological, one also has to try to understand them. Now, the Russia policy, I find the invasion contrary to not just the rules-based order as it is said to exist but doesn't exist, but of a future rules-based order that we want to build, potentially a universal order that can satisfy people all over the world. So I wouldn't have a Russian policy that can accept an invasion of this kind. What I'm dissatisfied with is that our policy towards Russia is very exclusive to us, the West. There was never an attempt to include others in that policy. And that, in fact, Joe Biden, whose foreign policy I profoundly dislike for many reasons, but also including that he chose to present the Ukraine war as a war between the West and the rest. He did. Whether you want it or not, this many times, and it's clearly his natural inclination to do this, to have a Cold War again of some kind.
You know, I wanted to add to this, the Russia question. I mean, I think, firstly, Catherine, I think you're right in the sense that there's been this kind of, switch of roles between, Russia, Ukraine in terms of European policy. I think the reason why I'm not sure the conditions are there to develop a Russia policy is that ultimately you can think of a policy as doing two sets of things. I mean, you normally, especially if you think you're dominant, you try and influence the other. And I think there has been this healthy reckoning as far as Russia's concerned in recognizing that we actually cannot and we have no influence over what happens in the Russian black box. And so we shouldn't even try to influence the Russian black box because it's just kind of, I mean, it's not something that's in our power to do. So we have the power to influence what happens in Ukraine. We don't have the power to influence what happens in Russia. Okay, so if you don't try and influence, then all you can do is accept, And this is where essentially the whole debate about transactionalism and all the rest of it, not vis-a-vis Russia, but in general comes in. But surely you can't accept when it comes to Russia. Because in a sense, it's not just that it's an authoritarian state. Okay, fine, you could relate to Xi and Modi and all the rest of it. But this is kind of going a little bit a step too far. And so what is there in between acceptance and influence? I'm not sure there is something in between, or we haven't thought of something in between. So I think we're conceptually stuck, and that's the reason why we cannot have a Russia policy.
Wonderful. Let's thank our speakers.